Hey Amarillo, I'm Jason Boyette, and you're listening to Hey Amarillo, the interview podcast featuring some of the most interesting people and stories of Amarillo, Texas. Today's guest is Matthew Wright, an Amarillo attorney who is the Assistant Federal Public Defender for the Northern District of Texas, which, as he explains, is a huge region that covers the Texas Panhandle, but also parts of the Metroplex. Matthew lives in Amarillo, and in his career as a public defender, he represents individuals who are accused of federal crimes but can't afford private legal representation. It's a critical job, it's a misunderstood job, that makes sure our justice system remains fair, and we talk about that. His clients' crimes tend to include things like drug offenses, immigration violations, and firearms offenses. And last year, a case he was assigned took Matthew all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In the summer of 2024, he argued a landmark case before the Supreme Court called United States versus Rahimi, and it addressed the constitutionality of prohibiting firearm possession by individuals subject to domestic violence restraining orders. That's a long description of it. The case is complicated. We don't go into all the weeds of it. But I did want to hear how an Amarillo lawyer ended up arguing in front of the Supreme Court in a case that made a bunch of headlines a few months ago. So that's what we talk about. Here's Matthew Wright. Matthew Wright, welcome to the Hey Amarillo podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm honored to have you. We've known each other for a long time at this point, but I want to start with you the same way that I start with all my guests, and that's just to ask why you're here. So what brought you to Amarillo in the first place?
Well, I'm an attorney, and I was working at a law firm in Washington, D.C., and helping people who had criminal cases before the Supreme Court. We would help them practice. We would pretend to be the justices and ask them questions.
Really? Okay.
And in 2000,
put robes on and stuff.
Well, no, we didn't dress up for it. It's called a moot or a moot court session, and I helped moot a former colleague from the Fort Worth office of the Federal Public Defender who had an argument in 2007. I got to know him then. I had worked for a federal judge in Houston. I said, hey guys, I'd like to get back to Texas someday, but I don't speak Spanish because a lot of people who do my job, especially in the south part of Texas, have to be fluent in Spanish.
As a public defender?
Right. I work at the Federal Public Defender's office now. And this is how I got to Amarillo and how I got involved in the FPD's work. And they said, well, we don't speak Spanish either because in the appellate section, we are appealing after we've lost, typically after a guilty plea or a sentencing. And this position opened up in Amarillo. At the time, there was only one other lawyer in the Amarillo office, and she had been doing that for many years, carrying a heavy caseload. And they wanted an appellate attorney to come and work on appeals throughout the district, but also to help here as needed. So that's how I ended up in Amarillo and how I ended up working for the Federal Public Defender.
Okay, so where did you grow up then?
I grew up in Texarkana.
Okay.
About as far east in the northeast corner of Texas, half in Texas, half in Arkansas.
Right.
I was actually baptized by a former governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee.
Huckabee, okay.
Yes, so I say I'm as close to an Arkansan as you can be and still be a native Texan.
Okay. Did you have, before you came to Amarillo, had you been here, did you have a perspective on this area?
So I had been from Texarkana to Glorieta twice.
Okay.
So we drove through Amarillo to get there.
Christian camps at Glorieta?
Yes, it was actually it was a music camp that my mother was going to.
Okay.
And that's where I met my wife. Her dad was at the same camp when we were very young compared to the present. So I had been through Amarillo twice. All I remember is how far away it seemed from everything. And after I graduated law school, I worked for a federal judge for 1 year, and my co-clerk had lived here for a few years. And I mean, I knew nothing about it other than the song and looked it up on Wikipedia when he told me about it. And I said, oh, that seems like kind of a good-sized town. But that was everything I knew about Amarillo before I showed up here for the interview.
Okay. Did you know that you wanted to get into law? Was that a plan as you got out of high school and kind of entered that stage of your life?
Oh, no. I am not a planner by nature. I'm very, some might say obsessive. I thought I was going to be a helicopter pilot. I thought I was going to be a Bible translator. I thought I was going to be, a tractor mechanic. All these are sort of unrealistic things, probably to avoid whatever I was worried about at the present. But I sort of stumbled into it. I had taken the LSAT my last year of undergrad and had an okay score, but I graduated in December in Austin and into a recession and was trying to sell cars as a car salesman.
Okay.
And
Is this what, 2008?
No, this was the
earlier recession.
The housing boom recession. So
Okay.
I graduated December 2002.
Got it.
Was working as a car salesman, and we nearly starved. My wife actually took my resume and sent it to a law firm and got me hired as a clerk and a delivery person because she wanted a regular paycheck while she finished her master's degree. And I still wasn't sure what was going to happen, but I remembered because I was in Texarkana that you could get in-state tuition in Arkansas. And when I say this was a last-minute decision, it was like, I bet there's a law school in Arkansas I should apply to. And
Probably.
there were two, and I applied to both of them. And I was sort of outside the normal application season, but they admitted me. And so we'd found out, we'd come back from her parents' house July 4th weekend, and I remember we saved that answering machine message for the longest time, said, hey, we're going to let you come. So that was July 4th, and in August we moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and that's where I went to law school.
So there's a lot of different paths you can go to once you go through law school. Like, did you know that you wanted to end up on the public defender side, or did you have other ideas and kind of stumble into that as well?
So I liked criminal law from really early on. I had a great professor. I was very interested in it. I had interned at a prosecutor's office for a while, but I thought I wanted to do white collar crime, which is, again, I don't know why, because as a law student, you haven't done much of anything, but it sounded interesting. And
embezzlement and securities fraud.
Exactly.
And that kind of stuff.
I suspect that it was probably in my mind that was a way to do criminal law and make a lot of money, which I've failed at miserably up to this point. But because my wife had a coworker who was married to someone who worked at Tyson Foods in their general counsel's office, and Tyson Foods had been represented by this law firm. It's a Chicago-based law firm, but they're based in Washington. The office in Washington, D.C. had represented them.
And Tyson's based there in Arkansas.
In Arkansas, right.
That's the headquarters.
That's the headquarters there. And so through that relationship, I was able to get what they call a summer clerkship my second year. That's where a lot of people do to sort of try out employers. Employers are trying out potential employees. And they were in a hiring mood. That was before the 2008 recession. I went to work there after clerking for a judge in Houston. But it started out as that. Now the judge that I clerked for in Houston is a federal judge, and I got to see the assistant U.S. attorneys and the assistant federal public defenders in there every day, and I was very impressed with their work. And this is why that's really when I got interested in it. I was like, these people bring their A game every day, and against long odds, and it appealed to me at that time. But once I got to D.C. and was working on some of these, big cases, 50 lawyers on the case, I just got really interested in helping people do these Supreme Court arguments in appeals. In a place like Washington, D.C., there's, you can't throw a rock without hitting an appeals lawyer. And so it was, very difficult, I think, to get a lot of that work. And anyway, you put that together with, I guess we sort of got lucky with these people from Dallas and Fort Worth came through in 2007, and that's how I ended up in Amarillo in 2008.
I want to let people understand what you do as a federal public defender, assuming that most people have the same legal education that I do, which is I've watched, a bunch of lawyer shows on TV. But you hear terms like appellate judge and, stuff like that, and we just don't know what it means. We just think it's something in the legal world. So what does a public defender do, and what specifically does a federal public defender do?
So a public defender represents someone who's been accused of a crime who cannot afford to hire their own attorney. And typically, when you use the term public defender, that's someone like me who's a government employee. So there's an agency or an organization that has people sort of on salary to do that, as many cases as they can handle, and maybe a few more. Other times, in places without a public defender's office, they will appoint a lawyer out of private practice who's agreed to accept that, typically for a reduced rate. So a public defender is typically a full-time person who represents people, criminal defendants who can't afford their own lawyers. A federal public defender is someone who is being prosecuted in federal court. There's no easy way to say what crimes are federal and what crimes would go through the state court system, through the district attorney's office, there's a lot of overlap. But just as a shorthand, I tell people to think about guns, drugs, and immigration, because that's a lot of cases that are charged federally. If anybody robs a bank, it seems like most bank robbery cases are prosecuted in federal court. A lot of my work deals with people who were charged with illegally possessing a firearm.
All right. Is there something about this work that you feel that you are well suited to? Thinking about, your previous idea that maybe you wanted to be in white collar crime, or maybe you wanted to go a different path as an attorney. Like, what has kept you as a public defender? Because it's not the traditional path to fame and fortune as an attorney.
Not yet, anyway.
Maybe a little bit of fame, right? But
definitely there's an aspect of challenge to it, and that appeals to me. A lot of what keeps me going, late nights and weekends, which is also not something you typically associate with government work. I mean, you take a government job, you're supposed to avoid that, is I think a lot about what I would want if I were in that position, or as I get older, one of my sons, what would I want one of my son's lawyers to do? Would I want the lawyer to say, this is all I can do and that's it, or to pull out all the stops and do everything that they could? I have daughters too, but for some reason, and when I'm trying to get motivation to get up in the morning, it's always my sons, I imagine, in that position.
These sons are more likely to end up in the legal system.
Statistically, that's
statistics, right?
That's right.
Maybe not yours.
Purely an empirical judgment on my part, I guess.
Tell me about the Northern District. I don't know much, but I understand that it includes Amarillo, but it expands all the way over toward the Metroplex area.
It does. So the Northern District is based in Dallas. There are federal district judges who are the trial court judges, the judges who handle both civil and criminal cases. There are district judges in our district, in the Northern District, in Dallas, Fort Worth, Amarillo, and Lubbock. There are courthouses in Abilene, San Angelo, and Wichita Falls. And there may be magistrate judges who are judges who help the district judges with their work in those offices. I can't remember. I don't think there's one in Wichita Falls anymore, but cases that are filed in those divisions get assigned to one of the district judges in one of the other divisions, one of the staffed offices. There are 4 districts in Texas. I actually have done some research to try to figure out why they have the shape that they do, because if you look at a map of the federal judicial districts of Texas, it looks gerrymandered. There are parts of our district that are east of the Eastern District and south of the Southern District. I think it's just a matter of historical accident. The first district of Texas was down on the coast around Galveston and Houston, because that's where the people were when the state joined the Union, and they sort of expanded up from there. And it makes very little sense. For instance, Midland and Odessa are in the Western District of Texas, but Abilene and San Angelo are in the Northern District of Texas. Yeah. And all of those places are closer to one another than they are to Dallas, where the district is based. So it's almost historical accident.
What does it mean for you, practically speaking? I mean, you live in Amarillo, you work in the Northern District. Are you constantly going back and forth to the Dallas area?
I do some travel, but I do mostly appeals. And that is mostly, it was on paper when I started, and now it's electronic records that are prepared by the court and provided to us. So I could do my job from anywhere, basically. So I get an appeal from Dallas, or an appeal from Fort Worth, or an appeal from Lubbock, and it's no different than one that came from here locally, other than I can go talk to the attorney who represented the person before. I can walk down to the office if it was in the Amarillo division. I have to call them if it's something else. Now, occasionally my work does call for me to attend hearings in some of these places. Sometimes I volunteer and help some of my attorneys in the trial section out. So I do travel a lot, but I'm not required to travel.
Most of your clients, do they end up being from this area, or are they from throughout the district? Does that matter?
They're throughout the district, and a lot of the drug cases that are prosecuted federally in this district, and particularly the Amarillo division, are people who were stopped on Interstate 40.
Okay.
They tend to have large quantities of drugs, but sort of, we would say, lower on the totem pole, if you will, or lower on the ladder. But for whatever reason, those are prosecuted federally a lot. So they may not even be from Amarillo. They're from California or New Mexico.
But they're tried here.
They're tried here.
Tried within this district.
Yeah, they were prosecuted here, and that's why. Almost everyone who is convicted in federal court, at least in our district, is sent to prison. And so when I interact with clients, it's typically by letter because we can set up a phone call, but it's difficult. But typically by the time the appellate record is prepared and I start working on it, they have moved to the Bureau of Prisons facility where they'll spend the next however many years, unless I can do something about that. And those can be anywhere in the country. Okay. I have clients who are in California and who are in Georgia and Alabama and just everywhere.
So it's not the typical scenario where we see the attorney walk into the prison and sit in a room while, somebody's standing outside with a gun or anything like that.
Yeah.
You're just writing letters to them.
It's letters mostly. It's occasionally phone calls. Again, I've done that. I have worked on cases, post-conviction cases, where the person had to be here for a hearing. And most of the Amarillo Division in-person clients are at the Randall County Jail. So, I bet I've been there 200 times in my career. But if I were a trial attorney, I'd be there 200 times a year. So much less than they do. I
want to give you a chance to answer the question that I know a lot of people want to ask people who are in your position, where you are defending people like who are the bad guys. In a lot of cases, or at least presumed to be the bad guys. They're running drugs or something like that. Tell me why that's such an important part of the United States legal world. Like, why is your work so important?
Well, there are any number of answers to that question. I could probably fill up your whole 45 minutes to talk about. And really, for me, it's different seasons of life, different parts of it, get me motivated to do that. But we have an adversarial system here, which means, for right or for wrong, we think that the truth is most likely to emerge from two sides who were both pursuing their interests, at peak. And the judge and the jury, if it's a trial, are supposed to sort of arbitrate between those two people. And the idea is not, let's compromise, though most cases do end up settling with a compromise or whatever. But the ultimate goal is nobody's going to compromise. Everybody's going to try their hardest. And if one person sort of takes their hands off the reins at that point, then the balance of power is going to shift.
They can get railroaded.
A lot of times we are defending rules that were made maybe not for the case that is before the court right now. Okay. There's some other reason that rule was there, but nonetheless, the rule itself was important. And I have friends who, will tease me because I won't even take candy into a movie theater, that I bought from outside because that's against the rules. Yeah. And they say, what is that? You work for these people who have done these allegedly horrible things. And I say, we live and die on rules, and so sometimes it's just the rules that I'm there for because they were put in for a reason. Other times, people are getting railroaded, for lack of a better word. Now, certainly, if my friends on the prosecutor's office were here, we might not agree on which cases were the railroading cases. I don't mean to say it's intentional, but certainly it's a chance for me to speak for that person who's been accused of it. I have only their interests in mind. The entire world could be against us, and they can depend on one friend whose job it is to go and try not to lose at the appellate court. Often, in fact, losing despite the best efforts, but at least I can give it my best.
Well, and that's another question that I think is interesting psychologically, is that you are, standing up for these people who are most likely to lose, whether because they're guilty of it or because of other reasons. But it's not a job where you get a lot of wins necessarily. And is that something you knew going into it and something that you've had to come to terms with?
Well, I have to come to terms with it every time I get a tough loss again. I mean, you can't do the job without believing that it's possible.
Right.
And trying. And sometimes, because it's an adversarial system and because I am often representing either the position or the person who is disfavored in general. Mm-hmm. If there's going to be a close question, if it's something that's uncertain, like the coin flip never falls my way, it feels like. Right. So it's, that can be very, very frustrating. I don't know that I knew quite how frustrating it was going to be when you're younger and you get into the work. There's lots of high-minded idealism or whatever. And then
It's a John Grisham sort of scenario,
Exactly.
right?
You go into there thinking it's going to be like that, and then Grisham has never sold a novel about somebody who just like ground out the years of his youth, unhappy, you know what I mean, and frustrated. But there's a lot of losing in my job. Sometimes you could say I'm a professional loser.
That's probably the best transition to one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you on the podcast, and it's something that we had discussed before, but you got involved in what was a very high-profile Supreme Court case in the most recent session, to the point that, I listen to a lot of political podcasts, and all of a sudden, I'm listening to the Slate Political Gabfest, and they're talking about Matthew Wright, and the Rahimi case, and I'm like, that's a guy I know, so that doesn't happen all the time, and I thought it was worth at least having a conversation about it. Now that you're on the other side of it, I know that there are some details that we can't really talk about, but give me like the basic attorney 101 sort of approach for somebody who doesn't know anything, why you ended up with that case, why it went to the Supreme Court, and why it mattered.
I'll start off with kind of how that case came to be, because that helps explain how I got involved in it. My client, Zacky Rahimi, was suspected of participating in a lot of shootings. No one was struck in any of the shootings, so that's probably the last good fact that we can start with in this case.
And where did these take place? They weren't
in Amarillo. They were
right?
in the Fort Worth area,
Okay.
Arlington, Fort Worth, between Dallas and Fort Worth. And it was not a federal investigation originally. They came to suspect that he was involved in a lot of these shootings. And while they were investigating that, they got a search warrant, and they searched the house, his family's house where he was living. They found a couple of firearms in his bedroom. And in the same bedroom, they found a restraining order, a domestic violence restraining order, because a former girlfriend and someone he shared a child with had gone to a court, and he had agreed that he would stay away from her. It turns out that in the 1990s, there was a federal law that Congress passed that said it's illegal to possess a firearm if you're subject to that kind of order.
Okay.
That turns out to be a very popular law politically. I'm not sure that any of us realize just how popular the law would be, but so Mr. Rahimi was prosecuted only in federal court for having the gun in his bedroom that day that they ran the search warrant.
Okay.
So we were
not for shooting it or doing anything like that.
All of that business is, it may still be pending in Tarrant County, Texas. That's state court thing. So it's relevant in terms of optics to our case. Our view was it's completely irrelevant to the federal charge, which is just merely he had a firearm in his bedroom and he had this order from a state court. And so the federal government says, thou shalt not do that. And so he was prosecuted. One of my colleagues in the Fort Worth office filed a motion to dismiss the case, saying that this federal statute was unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. There's an example for some of your listeners of maybe they would say this is an example of defending a rule, when maybe they're not as sympathetic to the person. That motion was denied. It was what they call foreclosed. So the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the intermediate court where most of my work is, had decided that the statute was okay under the Second Amendment years ago. The case was appealed. One of my former colleagues had the appeal first. He had worked on this issue before and had raised this argument. He lost at the Court of Appeals, and then he asked for what's called rehearing, a rehearing en banc, which is the entire Fifth Circuit, 15 or 16 judges hear it. While that motion was pending, the Supreme Court decided a case called Bruin versus New York State Rifle and Pistol Association. I promised you I would not fill up our whole podcast time with
Second Amendment. I can't say I'm familiar with it, but I'll trust you on it.
So the short story of that case is part of New York's concealed carry permitting law was unconstitutional. In New York, and particularly New York City, you had to prove that you had an unusual need for self-defense. So you or I might not be able to get a concealed carry permit because we're just like the general public.
Right.
Some people challenged that law. The Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional. But in the course of doing that, they said, if we're going to judge a law, a modern firearms law under the Second Amendment, it is the government's burden to prove that it's constitutional, and they have to do that by pointing to historical laws that are like this one.
Okay.
Not exactly like, but like it, relevantly similar. Well, at this point, it looks like we should win because there is no law at the time of the founding that was anything remotely close to the federal law, which makes it a crime to possess a firearm while you're subject to a domestic violence restraining order.
People probably didn't even talk about domestic violence, back in the late 1800s.
That's definitely what, we thought going in. We did a lot of historical research. It turned out that there really were a lot of responses societally to domestic violence, both kind of vigilantism, society, would run you out of town on a rail. And there were a lot of legal responses to it too. None of them involved taking weapons away. So we thought, look, this, whatever, however you feel about the Bruen analysis, we win under the Bruen analysis. My friend who had started this appeal at this point had actually accepted a job to go teach at Texas Tech Law School. And so he gave me a call one day and was like, hey, I had helped him. He had a Supreme Court case in 2019. His name is Brandon Beck. You can look him up on the Texas Tech website. He did a good job. He won, unlike me. He said, hey, you helped me with my case. Here's one for you. And so at that point, it was still in front of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, but we did have a sense that this could go big.
Really?
We won at the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit agreed that this law would not survive Second Amendment scrutiny under Bruen. And the Solicitor General of the United States asked the Supreme Court to take up the case. So I got involved in the case not early on, but sort of at the point where we knew this could potentially be a big case. And that's how I got into it.
I want to know what it's like, doing your job, because that doesn't really change, but having it move up to that top level. Does it feel like you're the pitcher on your Amarillo softball team and then all of a sudden you're pitching, in the World Series or something? Like, does it feel like, I have to do the same job, but I have to do it at this level where everybody's going to be watching me, and it feels like the most intense level you can get to?
If I could just tweak your analogy a little bit.
Okay, tweak it away, because I don't know anything.
It's more like I'm the second baseman on a church softball league team.
Okay.
And then I've got to pitch at the World Series.
Okay.
And this case in particular generated so much controversy, so much media
Well, it's
attention.
a Second Amendment, because obviously it's going to be controversial.
Second Amendment is controversial. Domestic violence is not controversial. Right. There's only one side to that question.
Right.
And so even people who in general favor expanded gun rights or a broad view of the Second Amendment, they certainly didn't want to say it extended to our client.
Sure.
But yet they liked the rule that the Supreme Court announced in Bruen, so there's this almost dance that they did to try to explain how we could defend this law on the perspective of comparing it to historical laws. So it was incredibly difficult. A lot of times when you have a case that's going to go to the Supreme Court as a public defender, there are law firms that will do everything they can to convince you to give up the case, and they'll let you sit there, but they'll do the work and put some of their people forward. I mean, nobody would take my calls about this. Nobody wanted this. We had one attorney, I will not share her name, who did offer late in the process, but by that point we said, listen, we're already far enough along. We'd rather you have what's called a friend of the court brief. Mm-hmm. The Latin, I say amicus. I don't know how. That's the East Texas Latin version. Amicus curiae is friend of the court briefs. There were probably close to 60 or 70 friend of the court briefs that were filed from everyone. The people who were against me were like the ACLU, mm-hmm. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. It's not just law enforcement groups. It's also the pediatricians were against it. You know what I mean? So everybody who's anybody is against us. And the people who were with me were very conservative organizations who, again, may not have liked what my client was alleged of doing with a firearm, but they wanted to defend the rule that was in Bruen.
Right.
And so it was a very interesting bedfellow situation. I compare it to when Apollo trained Rocky in Rocky III. You know what I mean? These are like people who are typically enemies of one another now working together.
Yeah.
And so that was the experience. So it was a very different legal analysis. There were not many cases, none from the Supreme Court. Ours was the first Second Amendment case after Bruen. The courts of appeals were all over the place. So normally when a case gets to the Supreme Court, there's been a split of authority, there's been years of litigation, and there's maybe 2 or 3 positions that are marked out. We didn't have that. So it felt like being lost in space in some ways. You don't even know which way is up.
What was it like actually arguing there? I mean, when you have I know you probably prepared for months and months and months leading up to that, but then like day of, you're walking in there.
So it's very intimidating. It is, if any of the listeners have a chance to listen to, go watch a Supreme Court argument in person, mm-hmm. they should. The thing that is most shocking is how close you are as an advocate to the justices. I have seen traffic court before, in the Amarillo Municipal Court, and the defendant or the lawyer, if there's a lawyer, is not that close to the decision maker. It is so close that you can, when you're sitting at counsel's table and you're looking from one justice to the other, you're craning your head from one side to the other. They are almost right there. It's very close. The Supreme Court bar tends to be a lot smaller. The people who appear there a lot in the Solicitor General's office and otherwise, there's a lot of tradition, but everyone from the person who, helps you when you check in and show them your license, all the way up to the people who are announcing, oh yeah, here come the judges, sit down or stand up. Everybody is the very best at their job. So it feels like you're operating at the highest possible level. And there's a certain sense of, at least for me, like I slipped in, you know what I mean? Like, you got, maybe I don't belong here.
Yeah, imposter syndrome.
Yes, imposter syndrome. I had the pleasure of being second chair twice before, so thank goodness I had seen people
you'd been
argue.
in the room.
I had been in the room. I had worked on cases before. I'd sat right next to the person doing it. But doing it, it's not at all the same. I thought it would be. It's not at all the same.
Are the judges all engaged? Like, are they all actively listening, asking questions?
It depends on
making eye contact. I mean,
there's eye contact. Sometimes they're looking at one another. A lot of what they're doing is they have typically not talked about the case since they decided to hear the case. So they get together and they decide to grant the petition for review. So sometimes the first time that they're talking to each other about the case, they're using the advocate to do that.
All right.
And so you can see,
like it's a conversation to you, but really they're
using it for them, yes. And so that is going on. You're getting the first sense of where the justices might be, So you go into a case and sometimes people think they know how justices will vote, but you don't. I mean, sometimes you can guess, but, we were wrong, at least on my side, as to how some of the justices we thought would be for us turned out to not be for us. And you learn that from their questions.
Okay.
You can't always tell from the question how a justice will vote, but you can tell what they're concerned about. And so it is very intimidating experience. It's something that I wanted to do from the time that I came here in 2008. It's because I'd like to do that one day. I did not feel that way when I left the podium that day. I did not think, oh, thank
You're
goodness.
not like, this was the pinnacle of my career, right?
Yeah, no, it did not feel like the pinnacle of my career, but much like the opposite.
You've probably done podcasts where people ask you about all the details of the case. Like, I want to know the personal stuff. Like, do you go into that, like, the highest of high adrenaline? Like, I mean, are you experiencing flop sweat standing there in front of, Clarence Thomas or something? And like, is it the kind of thing where it ends and you think, I wish I would have said this, or I wish I would have done this? And the performance aspect of it feels so intense to me.
I wish I would have said this is like my full-time personality. So I'm constantly
in front of the Supreme Court and then in front of
in front of somebody who's checking me out at United. Okay. You know what I mean? I was like, so for about a month afterwards, I had a dream, and in the dream, it was that thing that happened. That was a dream, and you get a chance to do it right after that. Which, of course, I just told you I never want to go do that again. Yeah. It was like, in a way, it was very, very challenging and hard and unpleasant. But I really did want a do-over after I got done. But that's normal for me. I mean, when I argue in front of an appellate court in New Orleans or Houston or Dallas, that's a normal feeling that I have. The thing that was really surprising was they changed the format a few years ago where when you get done with a normal time, each of the justices gets a chance to ask a question, as many questions as they want afterwards. Okay. And so a lot of my practices went really long, multiple rounds of questions after that. Apparently I did so bad at the argument, or it was so clear where things were headed, there was no questions afterwards.
Really? It was just done.
And so I felt, in a sense, I felt less nervous than normal because I was like, if I don't get the right answer out immediately, there will be a chance to clarify later. There was no chance to clarify, Okay. But it was pretty clear that we were going to lose to everybody, including us sometimes. I don't know if you're a Star Trek fan or not, but there's this kind of recurring theme in it. It's called the Kobayashi Maru,
okay, yeah.
Which is something that they said they do at Starfleet Academy, that it's like you can't, it's a no-win situation. They do it to test the character of the potential officer or whatever. I compared our case to the Kobayashi Maru a lot because there was a sense in which it doesn't matter whether we were right or wrong about the comparisons to historical laws. The court just wasn't going to go where we wanted to do. And I mean, it's fair to say, a lot of people would say that the Supreme Court modified its analysis from Bruin in order to decide our case the way that they did. I think that's correct. Whether it was because questions were left open in Bruin that they answered in ours, or because they just changed their mind, I don't know. I think that there were a lot of issues that were left unsettled by our case. Our decision was actually very, very narrow. It's almost like very few cases are directly affected by this.
Okay.
And some of the cases, some of the statutes that are prosecuted more often, felon in possession is one of the most common ones that's prosecuted throughout the country. We still don't know whether the felon in possession law is constitutional in whole or in part. And that's something that I'm litigating now. People all over the country are litigating it. I think that probably some people thought that our case would settle that, and the court was not ready to decide that. But so it was a very narrow loss, but it was a loss.
Yeah, so I was going to say the court voted 8-1?
8-1.
With Clarence Thomas being the only one?
He's the only one who voted for us.
Is this the kind of decision that, you're going to have some personal identification with? Like, will this be taught in the law schools? Will this be something that when people talk about gun laws is a significant part of that conversation going forward? Or is it so narrow that maybe not?
Well, it remains to be seen. The court is going to have to take another Second Amendment case within the next year or two, I think, because already the lower courts are dividing over what our decision means, for instance, for cases like felon in possession. And so does it, are all felons? Just for the listeners who don't know, I should say that if somebody's been convicted of a crime that was punishable by more than 1 year in prison, as a matter of federal law, they can't possess a gun, they can't own one, they can't have one in their bedroom. That's true for violent crimes like murder or manslaughter. That's also true for nonviolent crimes like welfare fraud. And so there's a lot of discussion within the courts about whether or not the Second Amendment limits the Congress's power to enact a law like that. So how important Rahimi will be, we'll know that after they decide some of these sort of post-Rahimi questions, I guess.
Do you want to be involved on any of those, or have you had your time and that's good?
With
the Supreme Court.
I am, in fact, involved in them. It feels like a daily thing. But
do you think you could end up back there?
Oh, I hope not, Jason. Okay. I really hope not. It's not to say if you'd ask me right afterwards, I say never again. I have written petitions for certiorari since then, asking the Supreme Court to hear a case. I'm not never again, but maybe never again for the Second Amendment, because it's just not yet what I think of as law. Law is, you're drawing from, traditions and precedents, and typically you sort of can understand the two sides of the question, and it's which of these two choices are you going to make? Right now, the Second Amendment it's formless in a sense, because part of that is because for most of our country's history, people pretended like the Second Amendment just wasn't a thing. From the 1930s until really 2008. There was very little attention paid to the Second Amendment, but there was a movement both politically and legally in scholarship to say, no, we should take this seriously. This is what it meant. And so a case called Heller, District of Columbia versus Heller, which is the first modern Second Amendment decision, sort of set us on this path. And so Bruin is really, in a lot of ways, a big, at least a clarification of Heller in ways that were unexpected. No court was doing what Bruin was doing, what Bruin told them to do before Bruin. And it feels that way after Rahimi, too. Like, we don't really know exactly what it's supposed to be. I would much rather know what the law is if I have to go into court. I like the rule, don't take candy into the movie theater. I know how to handle that. That's real clear. That's clear. I like clarity.
Okay, we'll switch gears, and this is the last question to wrap this up. Are you surprised that you're still here in Amarillo? Or that you ended up in Amarillo at all?
It's a surprise that I ended up in Amarillo. The first few years that I was here, I spent a lot of my time trying to get out because Amarillo is very different from East Texas, where I grew up. And we didn't know anybody here. We don't have any family who are close to here. We actually did leave and went to Dallas for 1 year. And my wife asked to come back, which was such a surprise because she was the one, I moved her from D.C., to Amarillo. but she loves the canyon. She loves the West. She loves the people and the friends that she made here. So it's growing on me too. I guess we've been here. I say it's very strange, right? Because I've been here since 2008, but I can't say, 16 years because there's that 1 year in the middle. So 15 of the last 16 years have spent here, longer than anywhere else. We have raised our kids here. We have 2 who have graduated Amarillo High. We have a junior and a sophomore this year. So as you know, most people in Amarillo, their grandparents are from Amarillo, their parents are from Amarillo. So I'm not that, but I'm like first gen Amarillo. We're from Amarillo. That's home now.
This episode of Hey Amarillo is supported by Dr. Eddie Sauer, who practices general dentistry at Shemin Dental Group. Eddie has been my dentist since I was in college. He's taken care of my kids' teeth ever since they got teeth. Dr. Sauer is a national speaker on Invisalign, and he uses that technology to improve his patients' smiles and positioning. We've used it in our family. We had great results. It's so much easier than metal braces, which are what I had when I was a kid. So you can learn more by following Shemin Dental on Facebook or visit shemindental.com. That's SHEMEN. Okay, I'm back with Matthew Wright. Matthew, this is the part of the show I call 8 Straight. 8 Straight is sponsored every week by Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon. It's the largest history museum in Texas, and its vast research center contains oral histories and legal documents from some of the earliest courtroom trials of Texas Panhandle counties. You can see those in the archives. If you spend time up there, there are books and books and books. You can learn more or see that at panhandleplains.org. Okay, when you think of Amarillo 10 years from now, what do you hope for?
I hope we've spent more money on infrastructure. Some of the people who preceded me here have put in lots of great streets and pipes and dams and schools and athletic facilities. It doesn't feel like we're doing that right now.
Right.
And a couple of times since I've been here, there have been big debates about it, and people have said not yet or not now or whatever, but it sort of feels like we're stuck on no. I hope in 10 years we've invested in infrastructure a little more the way that people's parents and grandparents did.
I guess we're seeing some movement on the streets, or at least the highways. But like the pipes, the schools, like those are showing their age.
They are.
And, when you neglect a pipe for a long time, like it becomes an emergency. And what you want to do is just avoid those emergencies.
Yes.
And that's Okay, other than wind, what does this area have too much of?
I don't want to say too many, but we're probably at saturation with vape shops right now. I mean, I love small businessmen. I fully support those entrepreneurs. But I think even they would say, you know what, we've got exactly enough right now. One more vape shop, then we'd have too many.
I always tell people when they talk about, well, we have too many coffee shops or too many convenience stores. I'm like, we would not have those if there was not a market for those things. Presumably, there's a market for just vape upon vape. It's not my world, but yeah.
Well,
they're everywhere.
Yeah, no. And
Ruby Tequila's on Sansi is now a giant vape shop. And that's what's so crazy to me.
Right. Multiple locations of the same one. Mm-hmm. And again, I maybe I'm not familiar enough with it that some of them will have some competitive advantage over the others, but it does feel like there's more vape shops than Toot and Totems now. And,
it's a business I should have gone into instead of podcasting.
We missed out.
What does this area not have enough of?
Trees.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can tell how old the neighborhood
East Texas guy then.
I grew up in the piney woods. I say the deepest, darkest East Texas, because we were in old growth forests. I love deciduous trees. You can tell how old the neighborhood here is by how tall the trees are. I love cottonwoods because they're the only trees we have. But I want to say, but there's an entire universe of trees. Some of them will grow here. Enough with the cottonwoods.
Okay, what's your favorite local neighborhood?
I got to go with Ridgecrest. We rented there when we first moved here in 2008 and bought a house not far from that. And so just as a matter of loyalty, I have to say Ridgecrest.
First home I owned was in Ridgecrest. The third home I owned was in Ridgecrest.
Nice.
I've spent a lot of my life, my kids' lives there. Love that neighborhood. My wife grew up in that neighborhood. So what's your favorite local restaurant?
This was very tough for me. You did send me these questions ahead of time, but I think I'm going to have to stand on Big Jim's on Olson.
Okay.
I can't eat dairy. I love dairy. Cheese is my favorite food. So you can get a non-dairy pizza there. You can drink a Pabst Blue Ribbon. You can watch, the police show, the 24-hour police show. Yeah. I got live music there. So there's a lot of competitors for that, but I think Big Jim's take the edge for me.
Big Jim's has done a really good job just creating a not just a culture around that restaurant, but like a very passionate clientele, that love that food. love that family, like all that kind of stuff. It's a real success story.
We started with when that was a Labella's location
Right.
under the Labella's previous owners.
Which wasn't that long ago. I mean,
No,
what,
and, you know,
6-7 years ago? I don't know.
COVID messes up all my timeline.
Yeah.
But, you know, I told you we had 4 kids. So at a time, you could buy a 24-inch pizza.
Oh, yeah. Labella's had the biggest pizza.
Incredibly huge pizza. And when we started going there, it was like $22.
Yep.
You could feed a family my size for that much. So that's how we started going there. But we love the new owners. We love the new employees. So.
Okay. What's your favorite local nonprofit?
Open Palo Duro, which is at openpaloduro.com.
Okay.
My wife, Darla, has started this. Her passion is public lands and access to public lands. She's trained as an anthropologist and archaeologist, and she has done so much research on the parts of that park that are public land but are currently closed to the public.
Right.
For various reasons. She would be a good, probably a better podcast guest. You can have her on to talk about it in full, but I encourage people, you can go to openpaloduro.com.
I think people don't realize that the state park is, number one, a very small part of the canyon system itself, but some of that is private still, but like a lot of it is public lands. It's just not the state park land.
I should say it's state park land. The state park owns
it?
a lot of the
Okay.
land. It is state park land, but it is currently closed to the public by superintendent order or by, there's people who have leased it, running cattle on it. But I don't want to be controversial on it, but
Right.
everybody can go to openpaloduro.com.
Sure.
You can look at the leases, look at the maps. You'll see that something like the majority of state park land is currently inaccessible to people.
Okay. What's the most underrated aspect of living here?
I think the cool summer nights.
Yeah.
Because I grew up in East Texas, you can't go out on your porch at night in East Texas because
It
it's
gets
still
down
muggy.
to a breezy 85 or something
Well,
when it gets dark.
But it's humid. Yeah, it's humid
Yeah.
the whole day. Whereas in Amarillo, you can, on a summer night, if you're not working late, you can sit out on your patio, and it's really pleasant most days.
Okay, I agree with that. Last question. When was the last time you visited Cadillac Ranch?
I had to get my wife's archival research assistance with this because the most recent picture we could find of me there with a rattle can was 2009. So that was a long time ago. But I do want to say in 2019, there was a lunar eclipse, and we were about 3/4 of a mile south of there. You could see the Cadillacs. We weren't, I don't know if you consider that at Cadillac Ranch or not, because we were on the county road south of it. But
you got outside of town a little bit though to see the lunar eclipse.
to get away from the lights, see the
Close
lunar
enough.
eclipse. So I think that was the most recent time I've been there.
Well, that's probably more recently than a lot of people. All right, that concludes the 8 straight questions. I like to close by asking my guests to endorse something. So what's one thing you would like listeners to know about or to experience?
I would like all your listeners to do a little research about how Amarillo College became integrated.
Yes. I know that story.
I love this story because I started doing this. It was a side project one time of researching something else. But once it's happened, we look back on the past and we always hear about it as though we just decided one day, okay, we're going to do it. But when you look at the newspaper stories from that time, that is consistent advocacy. People typically from the north side of Amarillo.
People like J.O. Wyatt.
People coming to the meetings and posting up there and saying, I'm not going to move. And as a lawyer and someone who has some knowledge of Supreme Court practice, I'm very interested in this because the legal argument that they made was actually under the separate but equal framework. We think of that as the past and a thing that we needed to get away from to integrate schools. But even that one required that there be some other facility. And so at the time, we had a junior college in Amarillo, but there was no equivalent. And the school board kept promising that they were going to build one, and they never did. That is a story of community advocacy, of people who were very brave and people who made that happen. And so I hope that as we celebrate that it happened all that long ago, that people will look and realize that that was the result of concentrated community effort.
Yeah, I will say that Brick and Elm published a story about that process. I think it was in January of 2022. But if you go to our website, we tell that story, and I loved researching it. I did not know it until I got to that point, and it is a fascinating story. So
I have not read that issue. I want your listeners to know we did not
okay,
plan that
we did
ahead
not
of
plan
time.
this, but that's one of the things I find myself talking to people about at parties. If it comes up, I'm like, let me tell you this story.
Exactly.
So I love that you brought that up. Okay, Matthew Wright, thanks so much for being on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And that concludes the episode. I want to say thanks to Matthew for the interview. You can read a lot about the Rahimi case online if you're interested. All the news organizations covered it. So go look that up. Thanks also to Shemin Dental and Panhandle Plains Historical Museum for supporting the podcast, and to Angelina Marie for editing every week. Thank you for listening. Hey Amarillo exists on a weekly basis because of listeners like you and the local people who support it financially through patreon.com/HeyAmarillo. Hey Amarillo's executive producers include Josh Wood, Corey Burns, Jason Burr, Katie Linger, Wes Reeves, Cindy Graham, Barbara and Jim Witten, and Patrick Burns. This has been episode 382. My name is Jason Boyette, and I'll see you next week.